Have you ever seen how a simple act of kindness can completely change a person's destiny? Today I'm going to tell you a story that will give you goosebumps and prove that generosity always returns multiplied. This story took place in Mexico City, on a cold February night last year. Santiago was an 8-year-old boy who lived with his grandmother Esperanza in a modest little house in the doctor's neighborhood. His father had emigrated to the United States when Santiago was 5, promising to return soon, but the years passed and the calls became less and less frequent. His mother worked 2 jobs. During the day she cleaned offices in Santa Fe, and at night she sold quesadillas outside a subway station. That particular night, Santiago had accompanied his mother, Carmen, to her quesadilla stand. He wore his favorite jacket, a small red hoodie with a golden eagle embroidered on the chest, just like the Mexican national emblem. It was the warmest thing he owned, and he loved it dearly. It was around 9 p.m. when it began to drizzle. The cold February wind made the temperature drop considerably, and Santiago could see his breath turning into small clouds of vapor. His mother was busy serving quesadillas to workers returning home late when Santiago noticed a man sitting on a nearby bench. The man looked to be in his 40s, wearing a suit that had once been elegant but was now wrinkled and stained. His leather shoes were worn out, his hair unkempt, and he was visibly shivering from the cold. He wore no coat, just a white shirt that was no longer white and a jacket that had seen better days. His hands, holding his head, showed calluses and small wounds, as if he had been working with them under harsh conditions. What struck Santiago the most were the man's eyes. They were tired, not just from lack of sleep but from life itself. There was a deep sadness in them, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. The man stared at the ground, lost in thought, oblivious to the rain soaking his clothes. Santiago watched him for several minutes. He saw how the man hugged himself to keep warm, how his lips had turned slightly blue, and how from time to time he looked up at the sky, as if asking God for something. "Mama," Santiago whispered, gently tugging on Carmen's skirt. "Look at that man. He's shaking from the cold." Carmen followed her son's gaze and saw the man on the bench. Her mother's heart immediately felt compassion, but she also knew they had very little. Every peso counted in their home. Every meal was planned to the cent, and they couldn't afford to be too generous without putting their own survival at risk. "Poor thing," Carmen murmured. "But Mijo, we barely have anything ourselves." Santiago nodded, understanding their situation, but he couldn't take his eyes off the man. Something about him broke his heart. Maybe it was because he reminded him of the stories his grandmother told about his grandfather, who had died when Santiago was very young. His grandmother always said, "Mijo, when you see someone suffering and you can help, you help. God sees those gestures and rewards them." The wind grew stronger, and Santiago could see the man curling up tighter to protect himself from the cold. At that moment, the boy made a decision that would change not only the stranger's life, but his own forever. Without saying a word to his mother, Santiago took off his red hoodie. The cold hit him instantly, making him shiver, but his resolve was stronger than his discomfort. With determined steps, he approached the man on the bench. "Sir," Santiago said with his soft yet firm voice. The man looked up, surprised that a child was speaking to him. His eyes, once full of despair, now showed confusion. "Yes, little one," the man replied with a hoarse voice, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. Santiago held out his hoodie to the man. "Here, sir. You're shaking from the cold." The man looked at the hoodie Santiago was offering, then looked at the boy. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he struggled to hold them back. "No, little one," he said gently. "You need it more than I do. It's very cold." But Santiago insisted, pushing the hoodie closer. "My mom says that when someone needs help, we should help." "You're shaking a lot, sir. I can handle a little bit of cold." The man, whose name was Alejandro Fernandez Valdez, though Santiago didn't know that, had been going through the most difficult time of his life in recent weeks. A month earlier, he had lost everything. His business, his home, and his wife had left with their children. He had been living on the streets, desperately searching for work but without success. That particular night had been especially hard. He had spent the entire day going from office to office, restaurant to restaurant, trying to find a job. No one wanted to hire him. His disheveled appearance didn't help, and desperation had taken hold of him. He had sat on that bench wondering what to do with his life, if it was even worth continuing. And now, an 8-year-old boy, who clearly had less than he did, was offering him the only warm piece of clothing he had. "What's your name, little one?" Alejandro asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Santiago, sir. Santiago Ramirez." "Santiago," Alejandro repeated. "Are you sure you want to give me your hoodie? It looks very special to you." Santiago looked at the hoodie, the one he loved so much, the one his grandmother had given him with such care. He hesitated for a moment, but then he looked into the man's sad eyes, and his resolve grew stronger. "Yes, sir. My abuelita says that special things are even more special when we share them with someone who needs them." Alejandro could no longer hold back the tears. It had been weeks since anyone had shown him the slightest kindness, and now a child, who probably didn't even have a tenth of what Alejandro once had, was giving him his most precious possession. With trembling hands, shaking from both the cold and emotion, Alejandro took the hoodie. "Thank you, Santiago. You have no idea what this means to me." Santiago smiled, a pure, innocent smile only a child could give. "You're welcome, sir. My mom's over there selling quesadillas. Are you hungry?" The boy's generosity seemed to have no limits. Alejandro looked in the direction Santiago had pointed and saw Carmen, who had already noticed what her son had done and was approaching with a worried expression. "Santiago, what did you do?" Carmen asked, not angrily, but surprised. "You're going to get sick, mijo. I gave the man my hoodie, mama. He was shivering a lot." Carmen looked at Alejandro, who now wore the little red hoodie. It was a bit tight on him, but it was definitely helping against the cold. "I'm sorry, sir," Carmen said. "I hope you're not upset about what my son did. He's very generous." "On the contrary, ma'am," Alejandro replied, standing up. "Your son just did something that very few people would do. You are very lucky to have a child like him." Carmen felt immense pride for Santiago, but also concern for the cold her son would have to endure. "Santiago, come here and bundle up with me," she said, opening her shawl so her son could snuggle close. Alejandro watched them and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That boy's selfless kindness reminded him that good people still existed in the world, that it was still worth fighting for something better. "What's your name, sir?" Santiago asked from the warmth of his mother's shawl. "Alejandro, Santiago. My name is Alejandro." "Don Alejandro, do you have a place to stay?" The child's innocent and direct question touched a nerve in Alejandro. "No, little one. I've been going through some problems." Carmen, understanding the situation, offered, "Would you like a quesadilla, Don Alejandro? They're hot." "No, ma'am, thank you. You've already done more than enough for me." But Santiago insisted, "My mom makes the best quesadillas in all of Mexico City." "Right, mama." Carmen smiled at her son's innocent pride. "Well, that's what Santiago says. Come on, don't worry about paying. Consider it a gift." Alejandro felt overwhelmed by so much kindness. It was as if this family had appeared in his life exactly when he needed them most. Alejandro sat on the sidewalk, carefully savoring the quesadilla that Carmen had given him. It was simple, cheese and squash blossoms, but for someone who hadn't eaten all day, it tasted like something out of a 5-star restaurant. Santiago sat beside him, chatting about his favorite things: how he loved animals, how he wanted to be a firefighter, and how he used to have a dog named Toby who had died the previous year. Alejandro smiled, nodding, listening with genuine interest. That little boy didn't just give him food and warmth, he had given him something far greater: company, conversation, dignity. In the distance, Carmen observed them as she tended to her food cart. Something about that man stirred something in her memory. His face seemed familiar, even through the fatigue and roughness of the streets. But she couldn't place him. She hadn't had an easy life either. Widowed 3 years ago, she had raised Santiago alone while working tirelessly with her small cart of quesadillas and tamales. She had learned to distrust people, to protect herself and her son at all costs. Yet, there was something about that man that disarmed her. As the night progressed, Carmen began to pack up. The customers had dwindled, and the cold was starting to bite. She called Santiago to her side, who stood and waved to Alejandro. "Bye, Don Alejandro. I hope you come back tomorrow." Alejandro waved back, smiling softly. "If I can, I'll be here, Santiago." Carmen looked at him again, still uneasy. "Good night, sir," she said respectfully, though her eyes were still trying to unravel the mystery behind that face. "Good night, ma'am. Thank you for everything." As Carmen and Santiago walked away, Alejandro sat back down on the bench. He covered himself with the little red hoodie again and looked up at the sky, where a few stars were fighting to shine through the light pollution. He hadn't felt this level of peace in a long time. But beneath that moment of calm, there was a secret, a past that Alejandro had buried deep, a life he never imagined would unravel in such a way. Because what Carmen didn't know, and what even Alejandro had almost forgotten, was that their lives had crossed paths before, a long time ago, in a completely different context. That night, Alejandro dreamed of his children. He saw their little hands, their laughter, and the last look they gave him before they left with their mother. He had made many mistakes, but what hurt the most was not having been given a second chance. But maybe, this street, this cart, this little boy who had given him his hoodie, maybe it was all more than just a coincidence. Maybe it was fate giving him one last shot. The next morning, Santiago woke up early, more excited than usual. It was Saturday, and he knew his mother would take him to help at the food cart again. But more than that, he hoped to see Don Alejandro. "Mom, do you think he'll come back today?" he asked while putting on his little sneakers. Carmen, busy preparing the fillings for the quesadillas, hesitated before responding. "I don't know, son. People like him, they don't always have the freedom to choose where they'll be." Santiago frowned. "But I gave him my hoodie. That means he has to come back, right?" She smiled weakly. She didn't want to extinguish her son's hope, but she also didn't want him to get too attached to someone they knew nothing about. Hours later, they set up the cart in the same place. The street was bustling, horns, conversations, the smell of roasted corn from a nearby stall. Customers arrived, and Carmen kept busy while Santiago arranged napkins and passed plates. But every few minutes, he looked around, hopeful. And then he saw him. Alejandro appeared from the corner of the street, walking slowly, the red hoodie now zipped up and his hands buried in the pockets. He looked cleaner. His beard had been trimmed, and although his shoes were still worn out, he seemed more alive. "Don Alejandro!" Santiago shouted, running to hug him. The man bent down and hugged him with a warmth that surprised even himself. "You kept your promise," Santiago said, his eyes shining. "I couldn't disappoint you," Alejandro replied. "Besides, I owed you breakfast." Carmen watched the scene with a mix of emotion and caution. She didn't like getting involved with strangers, much less those with unclear stories. But there was something different about Alejandro. He didn't seem like someone lost to the streets. He seemed like someone trying to find a way back. As they sat together again, Santiago talking non-stop and Alejandro listening, occasionally chuckling, Carmen brought them 2 plates of quesadillas. "You don't have to do this," Alejandro said, looking into her eyes. "I know," she replied, handing him the plate. "But I want to." There was a silence between them, but it wasn't awkward. It was the silence of people who understood each other's wounds without needing to name them. As the sun rose higher, Alejandro helped Santiago gather empty plates and even offered to carry a box of supplies. Carmen observed everything with a growing feeling she couldn't explain. He was helpful, polite, and attentive to her son, traits that were hard to ignore. And when he smiled at her, even shyly, she felt a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. But the past has a way of chasing us when we least expect it. And while Alejandro enjoyed those small moments of peace, he didn't know that someone from his old life had just recognized him, from afar. And that this peaceful street corner would soon become the stage for a truth that could change everything. The following Saturday arrived with a clear sky and soft morning air. Santiago was already waiting by the door, his red cap in hand and an eagerness that filled the house. "Let's go, Mom. We can't be late." Don Alejandro said he'd bring something to show me. Carmen smiled as she tied her apron. Alejandro had become a constant presence, quiet, helpful, and always kind. She had begun to look forward to those weekends more than she dared to admit. When they arrived, Alejandro was already there, leaning against the cart with a newspaper under his arm. He looked different, not just cleaner, but more present. His eyes no longer wandered as much. His gaze was steady. "I brought something for you, little man," he said as Santiago ran up. He handed the boy a small wooden horse, old, worn, but lovingly carved. "It was mine when I was your age. I fixed it up for you." Santiago's eyes sparkled. "I love it." Carmen watched the scene unfold with a bittersweet ache in her chest. That man, who once sat on the curb like a shadow, now stood there like he belonged. But the moment of peace was short-lived. A black car parked across the street. The kind of car that didn't belong in that neighborhood. The window rolled down, and a man in a suit stared in their direction. Alejandro froze. The air shifted. Carmen noticed his shoulders tense, his jaw tighten. "Everything okay?" she asked. I have to go," Alejandro muttered. "Take care of Santiago." Without another word, he turned and walked quickly down the street, disappearing into the crowd. Santiago called out, confused. "Don Alejandro." Carmen looked at the car, then at the man who had just walked away, her chest tightening with unease. The man in the suit stepped out. He was tall, sharply dressed, and his eyes scanned the street until they landed on her. He crossed the road and approached. "Excuse me," he said in a tone too smooth to be sincere. "The man who was just here. Do you know him?" "Why do you ask?" she replied, suddenly alert. "I believe he used to work for my company. We've been looking for him." Carmen narrowed her eyes. "He didn't do anything wrong, if that's what you're implying." The man smiled coldly. "That depends on who you ask." He handed her a business card and walked back to the car, leaving a tension behind that hadn't been there before. Santiago looked up at her, sensing something had changed. "Is Don Alejandro in trouble?" Carmen didn't answer. She stared at the card in her hand, her heart heavy with questions. Because sometimes, the people we try to forget are the ones who remember us the most. And Alejandro's past had just knocked on the door. The following days were marked by a strange emptiness. Alejandro had not returned to the plaza that weekend, and Santiago asked about him each day with increasing concern. "Did something happen to him, Mom?" "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe he had something important to do." But Carmen knew it wasn't that simple. Alejandro's absence weighed on her more than she wanted to admit. His presence had become part of their routine. Unexpected, yes, but strangely comforting. The way he listened to Santiago, the patience he showed him, the quiet dignity with which he carried his story, all of that had left a mark. She tried not to think about the business card that still rested on top of the kitchen counter. But each time she passed by, her eyes returned to the same name. Andrés Salazar, Legal Affairs, Grupo Rivas. The thin piece of paper felt like a key she didn't want to use. A key that could unlock not only Alejandro's past, but hers as well. That night, after putting Santiago to bed, Carmen stood in the small living room, card in hand, and stared at it for a long time. Her heart was restless. The next morning, moved by an impulse she couldn't fully explain, she left Santiago with a neighbor and boarded the first bus heading downtown. She got off in front of one of those buildings made of mirrored glass and polished steel. Tall, imposing, the kind of place that seemed to exist in a parallel world. She felt out of place, like a piece that didn't fit in that pristine puzzle. But still, she walked through the rotating doors and approached the front desk. "Good morning. I'd like to speak with Mr. Salazar," she said with a calm voice that surprised even her. The receptionist, dressed immaculately and holding an expression of polite indifference, looked her over from head to toe before picking up the phone. After a brief exchange, she nodded. "He'll be down shortly." Carmen waited in the lobby, surrounded by people in suits who passed by with determined steps, immersed in their phones or conversations. She felt invisible but not insignificant. When Andrés Salazar appeared, he was just as she remembered him. Tall, neatly groomed, in a suit that seemed tailored with surgical precision. His eyes, however, revealed a certain surprise at seeing her. "Mrs. Carmen," she said firmly. "I want to know why you were looking for Alejandro." He raised an eyebrow but made a discreet gesture for her to follow him. They walked in silence down a long corridor until reaching a small, glass-walled conference room. Once inside, he leaned against the table and crossed his arms. "You're braver than I thought," he said. "I didn't expect you to come. I'm not here for games. Just answers." Salazar nodded slowly and took a deep breath before beginning. "His real name is Alejandro Vidal. He was a financial advisor at Grupo Rivas for over a decade. Brilliant mind. He managed multi-million-dollar portfolios and had the trust of the board. But, Carmen asked, her voice tight. He made a serious mistake. There was an internal audit, an irregularity that implicated him. Before the investigation concluded, he disappeared. Just vanished. No lawsuit, no confrontation. Gone." She frowned. "So you're trying to track him down? Bring him to justice?" "No," he replied calmly. "I'm not a prosecutor. I represent the company's legal interests, and not everyone agrees on what should be done. Some think he deserves a second chance. Others would prefer he remained lost." Carmen crossed her arms, defensive. "He's not the man you're describing. He helps my son. He's kind. He's trying to be better." Salazar studied her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe he is. People change. But companies don't forget." There was a long silence. Carmen looked out the window at the bustling street below and felt the weight of everything she didn't know about Alejandro. Salazar's voice softened. "Some ghosts don't go away just because you light a candle." Before she left, he handed her a card identical to the first. "If he contacts you, tell him I want to talk." She didn't answer. She took the card and left. Back at home, the apartment felt colder than usual. Santiago was drawing dinosaurs with colored pencils on the floor. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Did you find Don Alejandro?" "No, honey. But I think he'll be back soon." That night, after Santiago was asleep, Carmen stood by the window and watched the city breathe. Lights flickered in the distance, and raindrops slid slowly down the glass. She wondered how many lives Alejandro had lived before becoming the man her son adored. Shortly after midnight, a soft knock echoed from the door. Startled, she opened it slowly, and there he was. Alejandro stood in the hallway, soaked from the rain, eyes tired, beard slightly longer than before. "I didn't know where else to go," he said in a barely audible voice. Carmen hesitated only a second before stepping aside. "Come in." He walked in slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid the floor might disappear under his feet. His shoulders sagged, and his clothes clung to his skin, cold and wet. From his room, Santiago's voice pierced the silence. "Don Alejandro." The boy ran out in pajamas, eyes wide with joy. He threw himself into Alejandro's arms without hesitation. "I missed you so much." Alejandro crouched down and hugged him tightly, closing his eyes. "I missed you too, buddy." Carmen watched the scene, her chest tightening. After putting Santiago back to bed, she returned to the living room and handed Alejandro a towel and dry clothes her late father had left behind. He changed in the bathroom, and when he came out, he looked younger, though tired. I didn't mean to disappear, he said. I needed time. Did you find what you were looking for? No. But I realized I already had something worth not losing. Carmen nodded silently and pointed to the couch. You can stay. At least until you figure things out. He sat down carefully, as if not wanting to disturb the silence. Outside, the rain continued falling softly. Inside, a strange peace settled. Some people run from their past. Others try to rebuild what's left. And Alejandro was finally ready to stop running. The temporary office rented by the Japanese investors in Polanco stood in stark contrast to the humble home in Colonia Doctors where Alejandro had spent the last few weeks. Dressed in the most presentable clothes he had, a shirt that Carmen had carefully ironed, Alejandro felt like an actor playing his former self. Yamamoto greeted him along with 3 other partners, all impeccably dressed. The conference table was covered in blueprints, contracts, and financial projections for Torres Esperanza. Mr. Fernandez, we're glad you reconsidered. Are you ready to sign? Yamamoto asked, extending a golden pen. Before signing, I need to propose some modifications to the project. The Japanese exchanged curious glances. You see, I've been living in Colonia Doctors these past few weeks. I've met the families who live there, their needs, their dreams. Torres Esperanza can be something revolutionary, but not the way we originally planned it. Alejandro stood and walked over to the blueprints spread out on the table. Instead of building expensive apartment towers that displace current residents, I propose we create the first luxury social housing complex in Mexico. Silence filled the room. Luxury, social housing? One partner asked, confused. Exactly. Premium quality apartments, but affordable for the families already living in the neighborhood. We maintain the highest construction standards but modify the business model. Alejandro began drawing over the existing plans. Instead of selling at market price, we implement a controlled rent system based on current local household incomes. Families pay the same as they do now for their homes but get modern, safe housing with quality services. But where's the profit? Yamamoto asked, frowning. The profit comes from long-term appreciation and a smart commercial component. The ground floor of each tower will have commercial spaces operated by residents. Carmen, a single mother I know, could own her own restaurant instead of selling quesadillas on the street. The investors started paying closer attention. We also propose a microcredit system so residents can develop their own businesses. Santiago, an 8-year-old boy who lives there, dreams of becoming an engineer. What if Torres Esperanza included an educational center with guaranteed scholarships for community children? Alejandro could see the business minds of the Japanese investors beginning to process the possibilities. Mr. Fernandez, Yamamoto said slowly, this isn't a traditional real estate development. It's a social project. It's a profitable project with social impact. Look at community development statistics in Japan, in Singapore. Projects that strengthen existing communities have higher long-term success and appreciation rates than those that displace populations. One of the younger partners leaned forward. How do we guarantee that current families can actually afford this, even with controlled rents? We implement a job training and entrepreneurship program. Each family participates in economic development workshops. Adults learn specialized trades related to the complex's maintenance and operation. Young people receive technical education. We create a closed economic ecosystem where money circulates within the community itself. Alejandro knew he had their attention when Yamamoto began taking notes. And your personal benefit in all this, Mr. Fernandez? Alejandro smiled. I want to be the director of community development for the project. I don't want to be the owner who lives far away and counts money. I want to live there, to be part of the community we're helping to build. You'd live in social housing? Another partner asked, surprised. I'd live in a real home for the first time in my life. Yamamoto closed his notebook and looked at his partners. They exchanged quick words in Japanese. Mr. Fernandez, this is very different from what we planned. We need time to analyze it. I understand. But I ask you to consider this. Would you rather be remembered for building towers no one in the community can afford, or for creating the most innovative urban development model in Latin America? As he left the office, Alejandro felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years. He had proposed something risky, something that might cost him the chance to regain his fortune. But for the first time, he had proposed something he truly believed in. He took the subway back to Colonia doctors, eager to tell the family what he had done. But first, he had a stop to make. Alejandro stopped at a construction materials store before heading home. With his last few pesos, he bought paint, brushes, and some basic supplies. He had a plan. When he got home, he found Santiago doing homework at the kitchen table, focused on math problems. Alejandro, how was your important meeting? The boy asked, looking up from his notebooks. Very good, mijo. But now I need your help with something special. With what? We're going to start building something here, in the backyard. A model. Santiago's eyes lit up. A model of what? Of what our neighborhood could look like in the future. Will you help me? Santiago immediately closed his books and followed Alejandro to the small backyard. Alejandro rolled out a large wooden board he had bought and began sketching the streets of Colonia doctors with a pencil. Look, Santiago. This is our street, this is the house we live in, and here. He pointed to a specific spot. New buildings could be built. Buildings for what? So families who live here can have better homes without having to move away. Santiago frowned, thoughtful. Like my friend Mario's family? His dad says they might have to move because rent is going up. Exactly, mijo. What if, instead of families being forced to leave, they could stay in new, beautiful homes? As they built the model with small wooden blocks, Santiago asked questions that showed surprising insight for an 8-year-old. But who would pay to build all this? Good question. There are people with a lot of money who want to invest here. My job is to convince them to build with the families in mind, not just to make more money. Like you used to do. Alejandro paused, struck by the child's direct insight. Yes, Santiago. Like I used to do. That's why I want to do it differently now. They worked in silence for a while, placing tiny wooden houses on the model. Alejandro, Santiago said suddenly, why did you decide to help us? I mean, why didn't you leave when you got your job back? The question hit Alejandro in the chest. He sat down on the ground, at the child's level. Do you remember the day I met you? When you gave me your jacket? Santiago nodded. That night, when I arrived here soaked and your grandmother let me stay, I realized something. My whole life, I've been surrounded by people who only talked to me because I had money. But you helped me without knowing anything about me. Because you're a good person, Santiago said simply. No, mijo. I'm a good person because you taught me to be one. Especially you. Me. An 8-year-old boy taught me more about generosity in 5 minutes than I had learned in 40 years. Santiago smiled, then his expression turned serious. Are you going to leave when you build the new buildings? Do you want me to stay? Yes. And my mom does too. And Grandma says you're the son she never had. Alejandro's heart filled with a warmth he had never felt before. Then I'll stay. But there's something else I need to tell you. At that moment, Carmen arrived from work, finding the two of them in the yard with the model. What are you building? She asked, approaching. The future of our neighborhood, Alejandro replied. Carmen, I spoke with the investors. I proposed something completely different. He told her about his proposal, while Santiago listened intently. Carmen sat beside them, taking in every word. And did they say yes? Carmen asked. They're considering it. But there's something more important I need to tell you. Alejandro took a deep breath. The investors told me how much money I could recover if the project goes ahead. It's enough to... To change our lives completely. Our lives? Carmen asked. If you want, if you'll accept me as a real part of this family. I want to use that money to secure Santiago's future. For his education. For his dream of becoming an engineer. Santiago threw his arms around Alejandro. You're like the dad I never knew. Carmen had tears in her eyes. Alejandro, you don't need to give us anything. You've already given us so much. It's not giving, Carmen. It's investing in the most important thing I've ever found in my life, a real family. At that moment, Doña Esperanza arrived carrying market bags. Seeing the scene, Alejandro hugging Santiago, Carmen crying with emotion, the model on the ground, she smiled knowingly. It was about time you realized where your true home is, mijo. 3 weeks later, Alejandro's phone rang at 8 in the morning. It was Yamamoto. Mr. Fernandez, we want to proceed with your proposal. With some modifications, but essentially, we will build Torres Esperanza as you envisioned. Alejandro closed his eyes, feeling a deep sense of relief. Thank you, Mr. Yamamoto. You won't regret this. But there are conditions. You will be the Director of Community Development, as you requested. And we need you to begin the community consultation process immediately. Community consultation? Your proposal convinced us because it focused on knowing the families. We want you to conduct a full survey of the needs and desires of every family in the neighborhood. The final project must reflect what the people truly want. When Alejandro hung up, Santiago was having cereal before school. Was it good news? The boy asked. The best news, mijo. We're going to build the project. Santiago shouted with joy, waking up the whole house. Carmen ran out of her room, and Doña Esperanza appeared from the kitchen. What's going on? Carmen asked. They're going to build the new buildings. Just like in the model. Santiago yelled. Carmen hugged Alejandro. Really? Really? But now comes the most important part. We have to talk to every family in the neighborhood, get to know their needs, their dreams. This project has to belong to everyone, not just me. Doña Esperanza approached and took Alejandro's hands in hers. Mijo, I'm proud of you. You came here as a broken man, and look what you've become. Grandma, I came here as an empty man. You filled me with purpose. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Alejandro, always accompanied by Santiago after school, visited every house in Colonia doctors. He met entire families, listened to stories, dreams, concerns. Dona Rosa, 80 years old, told him her only wish was to have a garden where she could plant the flowers she had cared for all her life. Alejandro noted, community gardens in each building. Mr. Miguel, an unemployed mechanic, shared that he dreamed of owning his own workshop. Alejandro wrote, commercial spaces for specialized trades. Maria, a young single mother, expressed her frustration at not having a safe place to leave her baby while she worked. Community daycare with flexible hours, Alejandro wrote. Each conversation added new elements to the project. Torres Esperanza was becoming much more than new apartments. It was turning into a complete ecosystem for community life. One afternoon, while Alejandro and Santiago were reviewing all the collected notes, the boy made an observation that left him speechless. Alejandro, all these families have dreams, just like you used to. What do you mean? You wanted to build big things. Mr. Miguel wants his workshop. Dona Rosa wants her garden. My mom wants her restaurant. Everyone wants to build something. Santiago was right. Every family had ambitions, projects, dreams to fulfill. Torres Esperanza wasn't just about providing housing. It was about giving people the platform to build their own dreams. Santiago, you just gave me the best idea for the project. Really? Yes. What if instead of calling it Torres Esperanza, we call it Colonia de Sueños, Dream Colony? Santiago's eyes sparkled. I love it. Each building can be named after a different dream. That night, Alejandro stayed up working on the final plans. He wasn't just designing architecture anymore. He was designing a complete community where every family would have the chance to build a better version of themselves. At dawn, when Carmen got up to make coffee, she found him asleep over the blueprints, a smile on his face. "What were you doing all night?" she asked gently, covering him with a blanket. Alejandro slowly opened his eyes. "Building the future, Carmen. Building the future." 1 year later, Alejandro stood in the same spot where he had first met Santiago. But now, instead of a neglected little park, the first structures of Colonia de Sueños rose proudly. Santiago, now 9 years old and a few inches taller, ran through the construction site wearing a yellow hard hat Alejandro had given him. "Alejandro, come see. They finished Doña Rosa's garden." Alejandro followed the boy to the first completed building. On the ground floor, where generic commercial spaces had once been planned, now bloomed a spectacular garden, tended by Doña Rosa and a group of neighbors who had discovered their passion for botany. "It's beautiful," Alejandro said, admiring the colorful flowers. "Doña Rosa says each flower represents a family in the neighborhood," Santiago commented. "And that the garden is growing because the community is growing." Carmen walked over from the second building, where she had just opened her restaurant, Quesadillas Carmen. She wore a new apron with the restaurant logo, designed by Santiago. "How are the reservations?" Alejandro asked. "Fully booked for the week. And not just from the neighborhood. People from all over the city are coming to try the quesadillas from the community that changed," Carmen replied proudly. Since construction began, the story of Colonia de Sueños had attracted national and international media attention. Architecture magazines, TV programs, and even delegations from other countries came to see the project. But for Alejandro, true success was measured in moments like this. Watching Santiago chase after his new adopted little brother, a 5-year-old whose family had moved into the third building, while Carmen planned to expand her restaurant and Doña Rosa taught gardening to the neighborhood children. "Alejandro," called a familiar voice. He turned to see Yamamoto walking toward him, accompanied by a group of people with cameras. "Mr. Yamamoto, what are you doing here?" "I brought some investors from Brazil. They want to replicate the Colonia de Sueños model in São Paulo." Alejandro smiled. In recent months, he had received offers from cities across Latin America to develop similar projects. "What did you tell them?" "That they'd have to speak with you, the true architect of this miracle." As Yamamoto led the visitors on a tour, Alejandro watched the complete transformation of what was once his life. Santiago ran over. "Alejandro, my teacher says a newspaper wants to interview me about how I met you." "And what are you going to tell them?" Santiago grew serious, as he always did when pondering something important. "I'll tell them that one day I gave my jacket to a man in the rain, and he gave me a whole family in return." Alejandro knelt down to the boy's level. "Santiago, I think it was the other way around. You gave me a whole family, and I just gave you back a jacket. Isn't that the same thing?" Santiago asked, puzzled. "No, mijo. What you gave me is worth so much more." Doña Esperanza approached, now the elected president of the Colonia de Sueños Residence Committee, a position she had accepted unanimously. "Alejandro, more letters arrived," she said, handing him a large envelope. "These are from Guadalajara. They want you to speak about community development." Alejandro opened the letters while Santiago clung to his arm. Invitations from universities, local governments, and international organizations. All of them wanted to learn about the Mexican model of urban development with soul. "Are you going to go to all those places?" Santiago asked, concerned. "Are you afraid I'll leave?" "A little." Alejandro lifted Santiago into his arms. "Mijo, I learned something very important while living with you. Home isn't a place you arrive at. It's a place you always return to. So you'll always come back here?" "Always. Because this is my real family. Carmen joined the hug, and Doña Esperanza wrapped them all in her arms. As the sun set over Colonia de Sueños, Alejandro reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had started out as a man who built buildings for profit. Now he was a man who built communities to generate hope. It had all begun with an 8-year-old boy who gave him his red jacket on a rainy day. And now, that same boy ran joyfully through a transformed space, playing with other children in gardens that bloomed where once there had only been cracked concrete. Alejandro, Santiago suddenly said, when I grow up and become an engineer like you, can we build more places like this? Alejandro looked around, the towers standing not as monuments to ego, but as true homes, the families walking through spaces designed for togetherness, the children playing in green areas where once there had only been sadness. Santiago, when you become an engineer, we're going to build an entire world like this. And as the lights turned on in the windows of Colonia de Sueños, each one representing a family, a dream fulfilled, a hope realized, Alejandro knew he had found his true purpose. It wasn't building structures. It was building homes. It wasn't accumulating wealth. It was creating community wealth. It wasn't about being successful. It was about helping others succeed. All thanks to a child who had taught him that true generosity isn't giving what you have left over, but sharing what you need the most. The red jacket Santiago had given him that rainy afternoon now hung framed in the Colonia de Sueños community office, with a plaque that read, "The gift that changed a world." Because sometimes, the greatest miracles begin with the smallest gestures. And sometimes, to find your true home, you first have to lose yourself completely.